Fellow Sazaitas, once upon a time, ZANU-PF had only one vice president, Simon Muzenda. But on the 22nd of December 1987, Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe signed the Unity Accord, the political deal that ended the Gukurahundi massacres. Resolution number 4 of that agreement stated that ZANU-PF would now have 2 vice presidents, both of them chosen by the president. This was meant to make room for Joshua Nkomo, who would join Simon Muzenda in deputizing Robert Mugabe. At the time, Mugabe was the Prime Minister of Zimbabwe, with Muzenda as his deputy. Kenan Banana was the president, but only in a ceremonial role. Real power lay in the hands of the Prime Minister. A few days after the Unity Accord was signed, the Zimbabwean Constitution was amended, taking into account the resolutions of the Unity Accord. The change removed the office of Prime Minister and created a new position, that of an executive president, with 2 vice presidents to match the new ZANU-PF structure. So the new political setup ended a very dark chapter in the history of Zimbabwe, one that Robert Mugabe described as a moment of madness. But almost 40 years later, we now find ourselves asking, does Zimbabwe still need 2 vice presidents? Do the reasons that once made it necessary still exist today? The dual system, once meant to unite the country, now seems to survive more out of habit and politics than purpose. And lately, the position of second vice president has started to look less like a symbol of unity and more like a burden. This position is carried by a man whose strength is fading and whose presence now raises a silent question. Is he serving the nation, or the nation is serving him? Or should I say, nursing him? Well, fellow Sazaitas, top soup and bingas, socialites, papalites, vasinamalites, varikudya rice, nevasinama rights. Welcome to the special report. Now, as a starting point, I want to make it very clear that my reservations about Mohadi have nothing to do with his age. Zimbabwe has had 9 vice presidents since independence, and some of them lived to a very old age while still in office. Joshua Nkomo was 82 when he died. Joseph Msika was 85, and John Nkomo was 78. Kembo Mohadi is only 75, which isn't that bad, especially when you consider the average age of most African or even American politicians. There are many leaders who are far much older than Mohadi who are still doing just fine. For example, Peter Mutharika of Malawi is 85, Donald Trump is 79, and Joe Biden was 78 when he became president. President Mnangagwa is 83. Depending on who you ask, of course, because ED's real age is a matter of debate. I mean, ask Professor Jonathan Moyo. I'm talking about the old anti-ED Jonathan Moyo, because the new one is, well, let's just say, if you can't beat them, join them. Once a ZANU-PF, always a ZANU-PF. Anyway, my point was this: for Vice President Mohadi, it's not really about age. It seems to be something health related. There are unconfirmed reports suggesting that VP Mohadi has in the past asked to step down due to poor health. Whether that is true or not, one thing is very clear. ED has never been ready to let go of Mohadi, partly because of his power balancing act. Mohadi is to ED what Simon Muzenda was to Robert Mugabe. You see, Muzenda was not ambitious. He was quite content with being a vice president, and Robert Mugabe felt safe having such a man as his second in command. In fact, there is a Muzenda joke which goes like, "Ndanzwa vanhu vachiti Mugabe ngaabviswe pachigaro. Saka Mugabe akabviswa, ko inini ndozoita vice president wani?" Translated, if you remove Robert Mugabe from power, who will I be vice president to? Mohadi is as harmless to ED as Muzenda was to Robert Mugabe. ED can't afford another Chiwenga as VP. That explains why he has never really been ready to replace Mohadi. I mean, the facts speak for themselves. In March 2021, Kembo Mohadi resigned as VP due to a sex scandal. You might say, a sex scandal? For such an old man? Well, I have no comment. But, as I was saying, Mohadi resigned in March 2021, but ED did not replace him. Zimbabwe went for 2.5 years without a second VP. In September 2023, Mohadi was reinstated as VP. So Zimbabwe was without a second VP for over 2.5 years, and we were just fine. This then begs the question, do we still need a second VP? Of what use is that post, especially now that it's being occupied by someone who is increasingly becoming incoherent and frail? The fact that ED was not able to replace Mohadi after his resignation suggests that he either has zero confidence or zero trust in the potential replacements. And also, the fact that Zimbabwe was fine for 2 years without a second VP and that ED did not see the need to fill that void suggests that there was no void to fill, and that the second VP post is not that important at all, meaning to say it can be dispensed with. After all, the issue of 2 vice presidents only started in 1987. Before that, we only had 1 vice president. Actually, there was no vice president. We had 1 deputy prime minister, Simon Muzenda. So, having 2 vice presidents was necessitated by the need to address Gukurahundi and to accommodate Joshua Nkomo, who had disbanded his party, ZAPU, to join ZANU-PF after the Unity Accord. So therefore, the position of second vice president was not created because of workload. 1 vice president is more than enough for a medium-sized country like Zimbabwe. South Africa is 3 times bigger than Zimbabwe, and yet it has 1 VP. America is more than 20 times bigger than Zimbabwe, and yet it has 1 VP. Australia is 19 times bigger than Zimbabwe, and yet it has only 1 deputy prime minister. Zimbabwe doesn't need 2 vice presidents. If anything, we are just wasting taxpayers' money on an unnecessary and irrelevant post. If Mohadi was fully fit and physically capable, then it would be a completely different ball game. But the point is, as it is, Mohadi is pretty much just a placeholder. But the bigger point is, he is a placeholder of a position that we don't need. Think of the amount of money government spends on Mohadi just for his upkeep. Think of the government expenditure on Mohadi's motorcade, his aides and security detail. Think of the amount of fuel Mohadi uses for all his official and unofficial activities at the government's expense. Think of all the wages and salaries of all the people who work in Mohadi's office. Think of all the foreign trips and especially hotel bills, especially in the case of former VP Pelezela Mpo. All these costs quickly add up for a cash-strapped, struggling economy like Zimbabwe. And who do you think pays for all that? It's the taxpayer. So all that for a post that we don't really need? Really? Moreover, there is this misconception that all former ZAPU members are by default Ndebele. This has led many to conclude that Ndebele shouldn't complain or demand for compensation and reparations on Gukraundi because they have a whole VP post reserved for them. But of course, this line of thinking is not only misleading and non-factual, it is also dangerously stupid, mostly because the Unity Accord does not reserve anything for Ndebele people. Nothing at all. But this notion of reserving a VP post for Ndebeles suggests that the highest political office a Ndebele person should aspire to is being a vice president. Now that is retrogressive. Such line of thinking has no place in a civilized society. No VP position should be reserved for one particular ethnic group, because by so doing, you are excluding that same group from taking up the highest office in the land, on the pretext that that group should be content with merely occupying the office of vice president. But the point I actually wanted to make is that it is not correct to assume that all former ZAPU people are Ndebele. ZAPU was not a Ndebele party. This must be understood by all. After the 1963 split of ZAPU, which gave birth to ZANU, the vice president of ZAPU was James Chikerema, a Shona. The secretary general was George Nyandoro, also a Shona. The chairman was Samuel Mnodawafa, again a Shona. This means that 3 of the top 4 positions in ZAPU were held by Shonas, not Ndebeles. Even after Chikerema left ZAPU, the vice presidency continued to be occupied by Shonas, such as Josiah Chinamano and Joseph Msika. Interestingly, some people mistakenly believe that Joseph Msika was Ndebele simply because he was from ZAPU, but in fact, he was Shona. His full name was Joseph Wilfred Musikavanu. In fact, when you dig deeper, you actually realize that even Joshua Nkomo himself was not really Ndebele, but Kalanga. But of course, this is subject for debate, depending on how you define the term Ndebele. But that's a subject for another day. The point was, some people assume that to be former ZAPU means you are by default Ndebele. The issue of making someone VP simply because that person is former ZAPU is flawed to begin with. Because look, having a former ZAPU member as a vice president does not address regional and ethnic issues because ZAPU was not a regional party. It was a national party. There is a chance that you might end up having a former ZAPU member who has never actually lived in Matebeleland becoming vice president simply because that person is a former ZIPRA or a former ZAPU member. How does that address regional and ethnic issues? My submission is that if this thing is meant to address regional and ethnic issues, then it's not supposed to be tied up to ZAPU, because ZAPU was not a regional party. ZAPU was not dominated by one ethnic group. Many former ZAPU members were not from Matebeleland, and definitely not Ndebele too. So it's not okay to tie it up to former ZAPU members. It might have been okay in the 80s and 90s when Joshua Nkomo was still alive, but a lot has changed. And besides, a number of bona fide ZAPU ZIPRA members left ZANU-PF with Dumiso Dabengo in 2008. Dabengo and his guys then revived ZAPU. It now exists as a fully fledged political party. The current president of ZAPU is this guy, Michael Sibangilizwe Nkomo, the son of the late Father Zimbabwe, Joshua Nkomo. So ZAPU exists as a political party and it is being led by Joshua Nkomo's son, Sibangilizwe Nkomo. So, is the Unity Accord really still relevant? And for the ZAPU members who remain in ZANU-PF, how do they feel when they see ED seemingly closing and sealing the gate for their elevation? Should they also wait for Mohadi's death, just like Msika, John Landa Nkomo and Pelezela Mpogo did? Remember, Joshua Nkomo died in office in 1999. He was replaced by Joseph Msika, who also died in office in 2009. Msika was replaced by John Landa Nkomo, who also died in office in 2013. John Landa Nkomo was replaced by Pelezela Mpogo, who was removed by the 2017 coup along with Mugabe. Mpogo was then replaced by Mohadi in 2017. Anyway, let's have a conversation in the comment section. Tell me, is the second vice president position still relevant in Zimbabwe? Is the Unity Accord still relevant? Was it ever relevant? If it was up to you, would Zimbabwe proceed with 2 vice presidents? But most importantly, if Mohadi makes it clear that he can't continue, who do you think ED will appoint as Mohadi's replacement? Would ED take that opportunity to retire General Swanda and make him a vice president? Well, whatever happens, I'll be here to marinate you with all the details without fear or favor, because on this platform, we say it as it is. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please like and share.